What happens when an Army general's son decides that his father's 4 stars make him untouchable and slaps an 80-year-old Korean War veteran to the ground outside a Veterans Affairs office in broad daylight? This arrogant young man walked into my courtroom believing his father's rank and reputation would dissolve every consequence before it could reach him. But when I forced that general to choose between protecting his son and honoring everything his uniform stands for, what happened next became the moment that reminded an entire country what the word service actually means. The defendant stood there looking at me like this courtroom was an inconvenience he hadn't budgeted time for. And he said in front of that injured veteran, in front of every person in that gallery, "Do you know who my father is? He commands armies. This old man is nobody." The room went absolutely still. But what nobody in that courtroom knew, what even he didn't know, was that General Raymond Mercer was sitting in the back row in full-dress uniform, every medal and decoration earned across 40 years of service arranged in precise rows across his chest, watching his son destroy the meaning of every single one of them. And the decision he was about to make would break hearts, restore faith in justice, and prove that real honor cannot be inherited, only demonstrated. Before we dive into this story, Kafu, less than 5% of you watching are actually subscribed. If you believe in real justice, in honoring the men and women who actually serve this country, and in holding the privileged accountable regardless of rank or family name, hit that subscribe button right now. This story is going to spread everywhere, and you do not want to miss what happens next. It was a crisp Wednesday morning, and I was preparing for what appeared to be a straightforward assault case. At my age, I have presided over thousands of cases, but something about this one felt different the moment that file landed on my desk. The victim was Harold Washington, 80 years old, Korean War veteran, a man who had given this country his youth and asked for very little in return. The defendant was 30-year-old Brandon Mercer, son of General Raymond Mercer, one of the most decorated 4-star generals in the history of the United States Army. To understand what happened inside that courtroom, you first need to understand what happened on those steps 5 days before. The case file told a story that made me set down my coffee and not pick it up again. Harold Washington had been to that VA office dozens of times over the years. It was routine for him, a man who had spent a lifetime treating obligation as something you show up for, regardless of how your hip feels or how slowly the morning is moving. He arrived that Wednesday the way he always did, deliberately, quietly, with his cane and his veteran's cap and the unhurried dignity of someone who has long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. He was moving through the revolving door when Brandon Mercer came up behind him. Brandon was late, not for anything urgent, not for anything that would justify what came next under any reading of any standard of human decency, but late in the way that men who have never been made to wait for anything experience lateness as an affront. He told Washington to move faster. Washington, according to 3 separate witnesses who gave nearly identical accounts, turned slightly, apologized, and continued at his pace. The only pace available to an 80-year-old man with a twice-replaced hip navigating a revolving door with a cane. That was enough for Brandon Mercer. He shoved past him with both hands, not a brush, not an impatient nudge, but a deliberate, forceful shove that sent Harold Washington's cane skittering across the concrete and took his legs out from under him. Washington hit the steps hard. His hip fractured on impact. His shoulder dislocated as he tried to break the fall. The laceration above his eye came from the edge of the step. He lay there on the concrete outside the building that exists specifically to serve men like him, and he did not cry out. Witnesses said he made almost no sound at all. Brandon Mercer looked down at him. He straightened his jacket. That detail appears in all 3 witness statements, the straightening of the jacket. And he said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Do you know who my father is? He commands armies. This old man is nobody." Then he walked inside. A bystander standing 10 feet away had been recording for 17 seconds before the shove. The phone captured everything: the shove, the fall, the jacket, the words, in sharp, unambiguous, undeniable detail. Harold Washington spent 5 days in the hospital, and by the time he was discharged, what happened to him on those steps had reached every corner of the country. The footage was online before the ambulance reached the hospital. Someone had posted it within minutes. No caption, no commentary, just 17 seconds of video that needed neither. By midnight, 12 million people had watched an 80-year-old Korean War veteran hit concrete steps outside a Veterans Affairs office while the man who put him there straightened his jacket and walked inside. The reaction that followed was unlike anything I had seen attach itself to a case before it reached my courtroom. It was not simply outrage, though there was plenty of that. It was something deeper and more specific. Veterans organizations began releasing statements within hours, and what struck me reading them was not the anger, but the grief. Active duty service members, retired officers, Gold Star families, military spouses, the language they used almost uniformly was the language of mourning, as if something had been struck that went far beyond one elderly man on a set of concrete steps, as if the footage had made visible the particular devastation of watching a generation's sacrifice be dismissed as nobody by someone who has never once been asked to sacrifice anything at all. General Raymond Mercer's name was trending nationally before dawn. His public affairs office issued a carefully worded statement expressing concern for Mr. Washington and confidence in the justice system. It was read approximately 3 million times and satisfied almost none of them. The district attorney announced charges before noon. The speed of that announcement told you everything about the pressure bearing down on every office connected to this case. By the morning of trial, my courtroom was the most heavily attended I had presided over in 30 years on this bench. Veterans sat in uniform in the gallery. Gold Star family members had driven hours to be present. Journalists filled every press seat and lined the walls, and over everything hung the particular stillness of people who have come not to watch a spectacle but to bear witness to something that matters. I called the court to order and felt the weight of every person in that room settle onto the proceedings like a hand on a shoulder. Then the doors opened, and Brandon Mercer walked in, and whatever remaining uncertainty I had about the character of this case dissolved instantly. I have presided over this courtroom long enough to know that how a defendant walks through that door tells you almost everything before the proceeding begins. Brandon walked in dressed in a charcoal suit, fitted and precise, with the kind of military straight posture that comes not from service but from growing up around it, the inherited bearing of a man who has absorbed the aesthetic of discipline without ever being subject to its demands. His expression was one of curated indifference, carefully constructed and carefully maintained, the look of someone who has decided that performing calm under pressure is the same thing as actually possessing it. He was accompanied by 4 attorneys. I noted that 2 of them carried themselves with the specific bearing of men who had military service in their backgrounds. Whether that was coincidence or strategy, I did not find it reassuring either way. And then he passed Harold Washington. Washington was sitting in the gallery, his Korean War veteran cap on his head, his hip in a brace that made sitting visibly uncomfortable, the faint remnant of the laceration still visible above his eye. He sat with the straight-backed quietude of a man who has long since learned that dignity is not something circumstances can take from you unless you surrender it yourself. Brandon Mercer passed within 4 feet of him and did not glance in his direction. Not a flicker of recognition, not a moment's pause, not the smallest acknowledgement that the man sitting there in a hip brace was the man he had left on a set of concrete steps. He passed him the way you pass furniture. I watched all of it from the bench. I have a practice of keeping my glasses on until the proceedings require otherwise. By the time Brandon Mercer reached the defense table and pulled out his chair, my glasses were already off. What happened next removed any remaining ambiguity about what kind of morning this was going to be. I called the case and asked Brandon Mercer how he wished to plead. His lead attorney was on his feet immediately, and I let him speak his 2 sentences of preamble before I cut him off. "Counselor, I am asking your client, Mr. Mercer, and how do you plead?" Brandon straightened in his chair, looked at me with those carefully composed eyes, and said, "Not guilty, Your Honor. Frankly, I think this charge is a significant overreaction to what was a very minor incident. A significant overreaction." I set my pen down and let that phrase sit in the air of the courtroom for a moment, because I wanted every person in that gallery to hear it fully before I responded to it. "Mr. Mercer," I said, "a man spent 5 days in a hospital. His hip is fractured. His shoulder was dislocated. Would you like to walk me through your definition of a significant overreaction, or shall we continue?" He continued. He described Harold Washington as a confused old man who was blocking the entrance and characterized what he had done as incidental contact that unfortunately resulted in a fall. The gallery, which had been holding itself in rigid, controlled silence, shifted in a way I could feel from the bench, a collective tightening, a fury so compressed it had nowhere to go. I came down from the bench. I walked past the defense table, past the bar, and into the gallery, and I stopped directly in front of Harold Washington. "Mr. Washington, would you please stand?" He stood. It took him a moment. The hip brace made it slow, and he needed his cane, and he did it the way he did everything, without complaint, without performance, with the full, unhurried dignity of a man who survived a war at 19 years old and has been standing back up ever since. I turned to face Brandon Mercer. The courtroom was absolutely silent. "Look at this man," I said. "Look at him carefully, and then tell me again that he was nobody." Brandon Mercer looked. The gallery waited, and his expression did not change. Not a flicker, not a crack, not a single moment of recognition or remorse. His arrogance in that instant was so complete and so chilling that several people in the gallery looked away from him rather than from Washington. That told me everything I needed to know about what this case was going to require, and that was precisely when his attorney decided it was time to play the card he had been holding since the trial began. Brandon's lead attorney rose with the practiced ease of a man who has spent a career making uncomfortable facts sound like reasonable questions. He began methodically. "The angle of the bystander's footage created a misleading impression of force," he suggested. "The concrete steps presented an inherent instability risk for elderly individuals with mobility limitations. Mr. Washington's own medical history was relevant context for understanding how minimal contact could result in a disproportionate outcome. Each point was delivered not as an argument so much as a suggestion, the legal equivalent of opening a window and letting doubt drift in on its own. And then, with the seamless transition of someone who had been building toward it from the first sentence, he mentioned General Raymond Mercer, not as a threat, as context, as a gentle reminder of the family into which this case had inserted itself, the 40 years of decorated service, the institutional weight of the Mercer name, the particular complexity of prosecuting the son of a man who had given so much to the very country whose justice system was now arrayed against his child. The implication moved through the gallery like smoke through a closed room, slow, pervasive, impossible to point to directly. I watched it reach the veterans sitting in their uniforms, and I watched their jaws tighten. I watched it reach the Gold Star families, and I watched them look at their hands. Brandon straightened in his chair. Something shifted in his expression. The first loosening of tension I had seen in him since he walked through those doors, the relief of a man who believes the cavalry has just arrived. I let the attorney finish every sentence. I gave him the full conclusion of every point, and then I set down my pen, folded my hands on the bench, and looked past him to the gallery. "General Mercer," I said, "is he in this courtroom today? What happened next is something I will never forget for as long as I preside over any courtroom." The silence that followed my question lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It felt considerably longer. From the 5th row of the gallery, a figure rose. Full dress uniform, 4 stars on each shoulder, every decoration and commendation earned across 40 years of active service, combat ribbons, distinguished service medals, honors from 3 different administrations, arranged in precise, gleaming rows across his chest. He stood at attention with the particular stillness of a man for whom bearing is not performance but habit, and the courtroom did not make a sound. Brandon turned in his chair, and the relief drained from his face so completely and so rapidly that what replaced it looked almost like a different person sitting in that chair. General Mercer walked to the front of the courtroom without being directed. He stood before my bench with the specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for several days and has finally arrived at the place where he can set it down. He spoke without notes, without hesitation, without any of the measured diplomatic distance that had characterized every public statement his office had released since the footage appeared. He said that his son had struck a Korean War veteran outside a building that exists specifically to honor men like Harold Washington. He said there was no angle, no context, no legal reframing, and no consideration of family name or military rank that changed what was visible in that footage or what it meant. Then he turned to face Harold Washington. He came to attention, sharply, formally, completely, and rendered a salute. A 4-star general in full dress uniform delivering a formal military salute to an 80-year-old man in a veteran's cap and a hip brace. Washington received it with a stillness that was more eloquent than anything words could have managed. Then General Mercer faced me. "Your Honor, Do not soften this sentence on my account. My son will face every consequence this court provides. That is my order to him and my promise to you. The courtroom did not erupt. It did something rarer and more human than that. It wept. And with the last shield finally down, it was time for this court to do what it came here to do. I gave the room a moment, then I put my glasses back on, straightened the file in front of me, and looked at Brandon Mercer with the full and undivided attention this case had demanded from the moment that file landed on my desk. Mr. Mercer, I have presided over this courtroom for a very long time. I have seen many young men sit where you are sitting, and in my experience, the ones who concern me most are not the ones who are frightened. The ones who concern me most are the ones who are not. You walked into this courtroom today without remorse, without acknowledgement, and without the faintest apparent understanding of what you actually did on those steps. I am going to ensure that understanding arrives, one way or another. I find you guilty of assault on an elderly person, on all counts, without qualification, and without any reduction in consideration of your family name or your father's rank. The lead attorney did not move. There was nothing useful left for him to do. Here is your sentence. You will serve 120 days in the county correctional facility. You will complete 400 hours of community service at VA hospitals and veteran care homes across this state. Not administrative work, not peripheral support, but direct face-to-face service to the men and women whose sacrifices you dismissed as nobody. You will attend 1 year of mandatory psychological counseling. You will compose by hand a formal written apology to Harold Washington, and you will read it aloud in this courtroom before you are remanded today. You will record a public video statement, unscripted, unedited, with no attorney present, to be broadcast across veteran and military networks nationwide. And you will make a standing annual commitment, arranged through the VA, to speak at veteran outreach programs about privilege, inherited status, and the true cost of contempt. I paused and let every element settle into the record and into the room. From the gallery, General Mercer spoke quietly. Your Honor, I have one condition of my own to add. Effective today, Brandon's access to every family financial account, every professional connection, and every door that has ever opened because it had the name Mercer behind it, is suspended, all of it. He looked at his son directly. You will stand on what you have built yourself. When we find out what that is, we will go from there. Brandon Mercer stared at his father and said nothing. For the first time since that morning, there was nothing left to perform, and what followed next was the moment that broke every heart in that room, including mine. The gavel came down, and the silence that followed was the heaviest I have felt in 30 years on this bench. Not the silence of a room that has nothing to say, but the silence of a room that has said everything and is now simply bearing witness to what comes next. Officers approached the defense table. Brandon stood. He reached instinctively for his jacket, that same habitual smoothing of the lapel that witnesses had described on the steps of the VA, and then his hands stopped, mid-motion, and dropped to his sides. As if the gesture had suddenly shown him something about himself he was not prepared to see. General Raymond Mercer crossed the courtroom and stopped in front of his son. 4 stars, 40 years, and a face that contained more pain than any battlefield had ever put there. He did not reach for Brandon immediately. He looked at him first, a long, steady, unflinching look, the look of a man conducting a full and honest inventory of every parental decision, every absence, every indulgence, every moment of his own life that had contributed, however distantly, to this room and this morning and this sun. Then he gripped Brandon's shoulder with one hand. I have given orders, he said quietly, that cost men their lives. I have made decisions in the field that I have carried every day since, but this is the hardest order I have ever given. Face this, all of it, every hour, every day, every conversation you do not want to have. Come out the other side, someone worthy of that uniform you have spent your whole life benefiting from without ever earning. Brandon's composure broke completely and without warning, not gradually, but all at once, the way things collapse when the last support gives way. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry. The general pulled him close. I know. Now show me. Across the courtroom, Harold Washington rose from his seat, slowly with his cane, with his hip brace, with the full and quiet weight of everything he was and everything he had survived. He looked at General Mercer across that room and rendered a single, small, deliberate nod. The veterans in the gallery rose to their feet, one by one, without a word spoken between them. Nobody saluted. Nobody needed to. The room had already said everything that needed to be said, and it had said it in a language that required no translation. I watched from the bench and thought that in all my years I had never seen honor locate itself so precisely, or cost anyone so much. That silence, it turned out, was only the beginning of what this story would become. 6 months later, Brandon Mercer walked out of the county correctional facility carrying a single bag and wearing the expression of someone who has been taken entirely apart and has put himself back together without any of the original instructions. There was no car service waiting, no attorney with next steps, no family connections standing ready to smooth the transition back into comfort. He had asked for none of those things, and that fact alone told you more about what those 6 months had produced than anything else could. The 400 hours at VA hospitals and veteran care homes had not been performed at a manageable distance. He had sat beside beds. He had listened. He had spent hours in the company of men Harold Washington's age and older, men who moved slowly and remembered everything, men who had given years of their lives to something larger than themselves and received in many cases very little in return. He had heard stories of service and sacrifice and the particular quiet suffering of people raised never to complain about either. And somewhere in the accumulated weight of all those hours and all those conversations, something in Brandon Mercer had shifted in a way that 120 days in a correctional facility alone could never have produced. He and Harold Washington met at a veteran community luncheon 8 weeks after his release, a meeting both men had requested independently through separate channels without knowing the other had already made the same request. What passed between them in that conversation remained private. Both described it afterward using the same word, healing. Washington became, in the months that followed, something close to an informal mentor, meeting Brandon occasionally, offering the kind of guidance that can only come from someone who has chosen grace over grievance and understands exactly what that choice costs. Brandon's unscripted video statement, recorded in a plain room, no styling, no second takes, no attorney present, was viewed over 5 million times and became required viewing at 3 military academies before the year was out. He speaks quarterly at veteran outreach programs now, telling his story without softening a single detail, without excusing a single moment, and without leaving out the part where the man he knocked to the ground on a set of concrete steps chose, without obligation, to help him become someone better. General Raymond Mercer attended every session, sitting in the back row each time, 4 stars, full uniform, saying nothing, needing to say nothing, watching his son become one measured step at a time, someone finally worthy of both. And that is the story I want to leave you with today. I have thought about this case every day since that gavel came down. I think about General Raymond Mercer rising from the 5th row of my gallery in full dress uniform, not to defend his son, not to leverage 40 years of decorated service on behalf of the family name, but to stand as witness to the consequences his son had earned and to ensure, with his own voice and his own presence, that nothing softened them. I think about what that cost him, not politically, not professionally, but personally, in the private accounting that only a parent can make. And I believe it may be the most courageous thing I have ever watched happen in this courtroom. I think about Harold Washington, 80 years old, hip in a brace, eyes still marked by a laceration he received on the steps of the building that exists to serve him, rising slowly from his seat with his cane and rendering that small, deliberate nod across a packed and weeping courtroom to the father of the man who put him in a hospital, a gesture of grace so vast and so freely given that every person who witnessed it was made simultaneously smaller by their own limitations and larger by the reminder that human beings are capable of this. And I think about a young man who walked into my courtroom having never once in his 30 years been genuinely required to account for himself, and who walked out of a correctional facility 6 months later carrying the first thing he had ever truly earned, the slow, hard, irreversible knowledge of who he actually is and who he is still capable of becoming. Real service is not inherited. Real honor is not a row of decorations on someone else's chest. Real strength is not the ability to knock an old man down on a set of concrete steps. It is the willingness to be brought to your knees by the full weight of what you did and to stand back up as someone the people you hurt no longer have any reason to fear. If this story moved you, if you believe that no rank, no name, and no family legacy places any person above the reach of justice, share this video with someone who needs to hear it.